For a moment, America's closest ally stopped taking America's calls. What followed changed the calculus of North American relations in ways that will take years to fully understand. And the question at the center of it all, the one nobody in Washington seems to have anticipated, is this: what happens when the country you have taken for granted for 75 years decides it has had enough? This is the story of how a trade dispute became something far larger, how language once confined to adversaries entered the conversation between neighbors, and how one leader's response, measured, strategic, and utterly without bluster, left capitals from Washington to Beijing reassessing what they thought they knew about Canada and about the durability of the post-war alliance system. Stay with us, because the full picture is more consequential than any single headline has yet captured. To understand what unfolded between the United States and Canada in the opening weeks of 2026, we have to go back further than most of the coverage has dared to go. The roots of this confrontation are not found in a single tweet or tariff announcement. They stretch back across years of accumulated tension, deferred confrontations, and a fundamental disagreement about what the relationship between these two nations actually is. Canada and the United States share what is routinely described as the world's largest trading relationship. In 2024, bilateral trade exceeded 1.3 trillion Canadian dollars. Their border, stretching more than 8,000 kilometers, is the longest undefended frontier on Earth. Their economies are so deeply integrated that a single automobile crosses that border multiple times before it is ever driven off a dealership lot. This is not trade in the abstract. It is physical, logistical, human. But beneath that integration has always lived an asymmetry. The United States is 10 times Canada's size by population and roughly 13 times larger by GDP. Canada sends approximately 75% of its total exports south. The American market is not merely important to Canada. For much of the country's economic history, it has been existential. That dependency created a particular dynamic in Ottawa, a careful, sometimes deferential posture toward Washington, calibrated to protect access to the one market Canada could not afford to lose. For decades, that posture held. NAFTA, signed in 1994, formalized the integration. Its successor, the USMCA, renegotiated under Trump's first term and signed in 2020, updated the framework but preserved its essential logic that North American trade would flow freely, that disputes would be resolved through agreed mechanisms, and that the three nations would coordinate enough to function as a coherent economic bloc. That logic began unraveling almost immediately after Donald Trump's return to the presidency in January 2025. His administration's second-term trade posture was, by most independent assessments, more aggressive than its first. New tariff threats arrived with regularity, often via social media posts before any formal policy process. Steel and aluminum tariffs were reimposed and expanded. The administration floated the idea of bilateral deals to replace the trilateral USMCA framework. And then came something qualitatively different from tariff policy: the suggestion that Canada might, in some future configuration, become the 51st state of the United States. That suggestion, however it was intended, was received in Ottawa not as humor but as a signal about how the current administration in Washington conceived of the relationship, not as a partnership between sovereign equals but as something more hierarchical, something transactional in a way that left Canada permanently on the subordinate end of the transaction. And it was that signal, more than any specific tariff number, that set in motion what followed. But what triggered the specific confrontation that brought these tensions into the open? It all revolved around two commodities, one political calculation and one moment in Beijing. The agricultural dimension of this story has been underreported, and it is essential. Canada is one of the world's foremost agricultural exporters. Its farmers produce wheat, canola, barley, and pulses at a scale that feeds markets across the globe. For generations, the American market absorbed a significant portion of that production. But Canada's second-largest agricultural customer had long been China, and in the period leading up to the events of early 2026, that relationship had collapsed. China had imposed tariffs on Canadian canola reaching 84%. That figure requires a moment of context. At 84%, Canadian canola does not simply become less competitive in Chinese markets. It becomes economically impossible to export there. The arithmetic does not work. 40,000 canola farming operations across Saskatchewan and Alberta, and the processing facilities, the rail networks, the rural economies that depend on those operations lost their second largest customer virtually overnight. These are not abstractions. These are communities, towns where the grain elevator is the largest employer, families whose planting decisions are made 18 months in advance, whose financial exposure is measured not in quarters, but in years. When the canola tariffs hit, Canadian agricultural interests looked to Washington for relief, or at minimum for recognition that Canada's economic difficulties deserved consideration from its closest ally. What they received instead, according to documented accounts and public statements from that period, was more tariffs, steel, aluminum, threats regarding the USMCA, and the suggestion, delivered publicly by President Trump, that Canada becoming the 51st state was not entirely off the table. Prime Minister Mark Carney had come to office in the context of this sustained pressure. His background is worth understanding because it shaped his response in ways that distinguished it sharply from what Washington may have expected. Carney served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, navigating that institution through the global financial crisis. He then served as governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, becoming the first person in history to hold both positions. He is, by training and temperament, an economist and a central banker. He does not govern by instinct or improvisation. He reads systems. He identifies leverage. And he is, by multiple accounts from those who have worked with him, deeply unimpressed by bluster. When Carney travelled to Washington seeking relief from tariff pressure and found none, he did not escalate publicly. He did not match Trump's rhetorical temperature. He did not issue ultimatums. He flew to Beijing. On January 16, 2026, Carney met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People. It was the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to Beijing in 8 years. The relationship between Canada and China had been effectively frozen since 2018, when Canada arrested Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou on a United States extradition request, and China retaliated by detaining 2 Canadian citizens in what critics described as arbitrary imprisonment. The diplomatic wound had never fully closed. Trade had suffered. Trust had eroded. And yet there was Carney, sitting across from Xi, in what observers immediately recognized was not merely a diplomatic visit. It was a negotiation. What the two governments signed that day was a bilateral trade agreement with terms that reoriented significant portions of Canadian trade policy. Canada agreed to reduce its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to 6.1%. In exchange, China committed to cutting tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 84% to approximately 15%, with implementation targeted for March 1st. The math of that exchange is worth sitting with. Canola farmers who had been locked out of the Chinese market were suddenly looking at preferential access. The lifeline was real, measurable, and immediate. But the electric vehicle component of the agreement was geopolitically the more seismic element. And this is where the loop we opened at the beginning of this report begins to close, because what Carney signed in Beijing was not just a trade deal. It was a statement about sovereignty, about the limits of dependency, and about what Canada would do when its options narrowed. The United States had imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles precisely to exclude them from the North American market. The policy was explicit. Chinese EVs were not welcome. Under the Canada-China agreement, up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles per year could enter Canada at the reduced tariff rate. Trade analysts noted that figure nearly matched pre-tariff import levels. Carney was not cracking a door, he was opening one. The initial response from President Trump was, by Washington standards, restrained. Asked about the deal on Friday, January 16th, Trump told reporters that if Canada could get a deal with China, they should. But that public tone did not persist through his administration. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer stated that Canada would regret the decision. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy described the entry of Chinese vehicles into the Canadian market as a mistake. The message from within the administration was unmistakable. Washington viewed this as a direct challenge. And then, 5 days later, the scene shifted to Davos, Switzerland, the World Economic Forum, January 20th through 21st, 2026. 2 speeches, same venue, less than 24 hours apart, and a contrast so stark it became the lens through which the international community interpreted everything that had come before. Carney took the Davos stage on Tuesday, January 20th. What he delivered was not a speech in the conventional sense of political performance. It was a diagnosis. He told his audience, many of whom managed trillions of dollars in capital and whose assessments of risk shape the global economy, that the rules-based international order was not declining. It was over. He used a specific word: rupture. Not transition, not evolution, rupture. A breaking apart. He described what he called a useful fiction, the shared assumption that all nations operated within the same framework of rules and that the most powerful nations exercised restraint. He acknowledged the fiction had always been imperfect, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, but he argued that fiction had served a purpose. And now, he said, it was gone. The room understood the context. Trump had been threatening military action against Greenland, a territory of Denmark and a NATO member. He had threatened tariffs against 8 European nations. He had suggested that Greenland's territorial sovereignty was negotiable, and Carney, without once naming Trump, addressed it directly. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. He spoke about what he called middle powers, nations with significant capacity but not enough to stand alone against the true giants, and he told them something that landed in that room with the force of long-deferred truth. If you are not at the table, he said, you are on the menu. He outlined what Canada had been doing since he took office: doubling defence spending, signing 12 new trade and security agreements across 4 continents in 6 months, drawing closer to the European Union, building what he described as strategic autonomy, the capacity to resist pressure, the capacity to say no. He addressed Greenland directly, stating Canada's firm support for Greenland and Denmark's right to determine their own future. He called it a test of NATO. He opposed the threatened tariffs, and then he sat down. No flags waved, no ultimatums issued, no names called. International reaction was immediate. The BBC described it as one of the most consequential speeches by a world leader in recent years. Foreign policy analysts across Europe characterized it as the articulation of what many governments had been thinking privately, but had been reluctant to say aloud. Less than 24 hours later, Donald Trump took the same stage at Davos. And the contrast that followed illuminated something important about where the two leaders and the two countries now stood in relation to each other and to the broader international order. Trump's Davos address covered familiar territory, his administration's accomplishments, his view of America's strength, his signature mixture of humor and implication. But observers and journalists present noted that when the subject turned to Greenland, something changed. For weeks, Trump had escalated on Greenland with increasing intensity. He had sent his son on a widely covered visit to the island. He had appointed a special envoy whose stated purpose was to work toward American acquisition of the territory. He had threatened Denmark with tariffs. He had refused, repeatedly and on record, to rule out military force. Europe had responded by unifying. Denmark, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands and the United Kingdom coordinated responses. Several deployed troops to Greenland for joint exercises. Not as a provocation, their governments were careful to state, but as a demonstration of collective solidarity with an ally. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said Europe would remain united. French President Emmanuel Macron gave speeches stating France would not yield to intimidation. The Danish foreign minister held firm on the non-negotiability of Greenlandic territorial integrity. At Davos, Trump announced what he described as a framework for a future deal with NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte regarding Greenland and the Arctic. Based on this framework, he said, he would not be imposing the tariffs he had scheduled for February 1st. He described it as the concept of a deal, a framework. When pressed on whether the United States had abandoned its claim to ownership of Greenland, Trump said only that it was complex and that he did not want to say yet. The Danish foreign minister, asked to respond, said that Denmark would not negotiate on the basis of abandoning fundamental principles, and added with notable precision, "We live in 2026. Shortly after Davos, Trump stated explicitly that military force regarding Greenland was not on the table. He had spent weeks refusing to say that. Now he said it. What the sequence of events in January 2026 revealed is something that historians of international relations will likely spend years analyzing. It revealed that the assumptions undergirding the post-war Western alliance system, assumptions about American restraint, American predictability, and the value of alignment with Washington, had become genuinely uncertain in the minds of America's closest partners. And it revealed that when those assumptions became uncertain, partners did not simply wait for clarity, they acted. Carney acted by going to Beijing and securing terms that diversified Canada's economic exposure. He acted by standing at Davos and telling the global financial community that the old order had ended and that middle powers needed to build something new. He acted without drama, without the elevated rhetoric of grievance or accusation, and precisely because of that restraint, he was heard. The implications for North American trade are structural and, in the assessment of most independent economists, long-term. The USMCA comes up for mandatory review on July 1, 2026. That review, which under ordinary circumstances would be a procedural exercise in extending and updating a functional agreement, now takes place in a context that is anything but ordinary. Trump has described the agreement as irrelevant. Carney has demonstrated that Canada is prepared to look elsewhere. Mexico, which surpassed Canada as America's largest trading partner in recent years, is watching and calculating. The automotive industry, whose integrated North American supply chains cross the border multiple times per vehicle, is operating under conditions of sustained uncertainty. Manufacturers report delays in investment decisions. Companies are building inventory buffers against the possibility of tariff disruption. Contracts that would ordinarily be signed over years of planning are being held. What economists describe as supply chain paralysis is not a single catastrophic event. It is the aggregation of thousands of decisions deferred, investments withheld, plans contingent on regulatory stability that no longer exists. It is the compound interest of uncertainty applied across an economy over time. And it is, in the view of analysts cited by the Council on Foreign Relations and other institutions, already accumulating. The canola farmer in Saskatchewan who does not know whether the Canadian or American market will be more reliable next planting season is making decisions today based on that uncertainty. The auto parts manufacturer in Ontario, whose American customer base has been threatened with tariff exposure, is hedging today against a disruption that may or may not materialize. The grain elevator operator whose infrastructure was built on the assumption of open borders is carrying costs today for optionality that the system was never designed to require. None of these individual decisions is a crisis. Together, they represent a reorientation. And reorientations of this kind, once they reach a certain threshold of infrastructure investment and contractual commitment, do not simply reverse when political winds shift. The supply chains that are being reconsidered now, the relationships being formed or reformed, the market access being established through new agreements, these have a durability that outlasts any single administration. That is the structural reality beneath the headlines about statements and counter-statements, tariff threats, and trade frameworks. And it is why the events of January 2026 matter not as a moment of diplomatic theatre, though they were that too, but as a pivot point in the long architecture of North American and global economic relations. What we have witnessed in these weeks is not a rupture in the sense of sudden collapse. It is a rupture in the sense that Carney described at Davos. A tearing of the fabric of assumptions that held a system together. The fabric had been under stress for years. The events of January 2026 made the tear visible. What remains genuinely uncertain, and it is worth being precise about the limits of what we can know, is what happens next. Whether the USMCA review in July produces a renewed agreement, a prolonged negotiation, or a fundamental restructuring is not yet determined. Whether the Canada-China trade agreement deepens into a broader realignment or remains a specific bounded response to specific bounded pressures is not yet clear. Whether the precedent set at Davos, the demonstration that European allies would coordinate resistance to threats against sovereign territory, changes the calculus of American foreign policy in the near term is an open question. What is clear is this: the relationship between the United States and its allies in the winter of 2026 is different from what it was a year ago. The difference is not rhetorical, it is behavioral. Allies who once deferred are diversifying. Partners who once absorbed pressure are recalibrating. And a Canadian Prime Minister trained as an economist, governed by the discipline of a central banker, stood in the Swiss Alps and told the world that the old order was over, that nostalgia would not restore it, and that the work of building something better together had already begun. That is not a small thing. And the question of whether it becomes the beginning of a new framework or merely a moment of clarity before the world reverts to familiar patterns is one that the months ahead will answer. but that this moment has made unavoidable to ask. What is certain is that Canada's response to this pressure, whatever one's assessment of its wisdom or its risks, was not the response of a country that saw itself as the 51st state. It was the response of a sovereign nation making sovereign choices. And the world took note.